Between November 12th and 15th, 1972, 10 people were eliminated across 3 counties in eastern Kentucky in what would become known as the Harlan County Territorial Purge. All adults, all connected to competing moonshine operations. The method was surgical, rifle shots from distance, staged accidents on dark mountain roads, explosions that weren't accidents. The perpetrators weren't rival gangs or federal agents. They were 4 members of the Walker family, a father and his 3 sons, moving through the Kentucky hills like ghosts, methodically erasing everyone who controlled land they believed was stolen. The FBI would later call it one of the most calculated territorial eliminations in Appalachian moonshine history. But the motive wasn't money, wasn't a drug war, wasn't even revenge for violence. It was 40 acres of limestone springwater land their grandfather had been cheated out of in 1923 during a rigged poker game, and one man's unshakable belief that some debts can only be settled in blood. If you have the courage to hear this story, leave your like and subscribe to the channel. But I warn you, this narrative contains extreme violence based on real events. Harlan County, Kentucky, sprawled across 476 square miles of some of the most unforgiving terrain in the eastern United States in 1972. The Cumberland Mountains rose like ancient walls, their peaks reaching over 4,000 feet, their valleys so narrow and deep that sunlight only touched the bottom for a few hours each day. Population stood around 12,000, down from 35,000 in the boom years of the 1950s when coal was king. The county seat, also called Harlan, held barely 3,000 souls who knew each other's business, each other's secrets, and each other's grudges going back generations. November in Harlan meant temperatures dropping to the low 30s at night, creeping up to maybe 50 by mid-afternoon if you were lucky. The air smelled like wood smoke from coal stoves and fireplaces mixed with the sweet rot of fallen leaves and the metallic tang of mountain streams running cold over limestone. At night, when fog rolled down from the ridges, you could hear owls calling across the hollows and the distant barking of dogs, chained outside trailers and cabins, scattered through the hills. Sound traveled strange in those mountains. Sometimes you'd hear a truck engine 2 miles away, clear as a bell. Other times, you wouldn't hear a man walking 10 feet behind you. The main towns, places like Evarts, Cumberland, and Loyal, were little more than wide spots in the road where state highways curved through the mountains. Feed stores with peeling paint, gas stations with 2 pumps, churches every quarter mile, and bars that opened at noon and closed when the last customer left or the fights got too serious. But 1972 was a devastating year for coal country. The mining industry that had sustained Harlan County for nearly a century was in freefall. Mines that had employed thousands now sat abandoned, their entrances sealed with concrete, their machinery rusting in the rain. Unemployment hovered around 40%. Men who'd spent their entire adult lives underground, breathing coal dust, risking their lives for union wages, now had nothing. No jobs, no prospects, no way to feed their families except disability checks that barely covered rent and food stamps, that bought humiliation at the checkout counter. Vietnam was ending, but not fast enough. Body bags still came home to these mountains. Young men who'd survived rice paddies and jungle ambushes returned to find no work, no future, just the same dying towns their fathers had tried to escape. The draft had taken 327 boys from Harlan County between 1964 and 1972. 81 hadn't come back. The ones who did brought nightmares and rage and a particular understanding of violence that would shape what happened that November. Samuel James Walker was 58 years old that November, though he looked closer to 70. He stood 6 feet tall but stooped forward slightly from 3 decades spent hunched over copper stills in cramped spaces. His hands were massive, knuckles swollen with arthritis, fingers permanently stained from handling copper coils and corn mash. A thick scar ran from his right temple down to his jawline, souvenir from a mortar round that landed 30 feet from his position in Korea, 1951. Shrapnel had killed the 2 men beside him. Sam had walked away with ringing ears and a face that would never look the same. He walked with a slight limp, legacy of the same explosion. And when the weather turned cold, that limp became pronounced enough that his youngest son had to help him up the porch steps. Every morning, Sam woke at 4:45, made coffee in a percolator so old the bottom was worn thin, and sat at his kitchen table reading from a King James Bible his mother had given him in 1934. He'd read 1 chapter, drink his coffee, black and strong, then step outside to watch the sun come up over Pine Mountain. He'd smoke 1 cigarette, unfiltered Pall Mall rolled so tight it lasted 15 minutes, and then he'd start his day. Check the still hidden 3 miles up Martin's Fork, test the mash, monitor the temperature, collect the shine, and transfer it to mason jars that would be sold to distributors as far away as Lexington and Cincinnati. He'd married Martha Louise Henderson in 1942, right after his discharge from the Army following basic training. They'd had 3 boys. Marcus was 32 now, back from Vietnam, with nightmares and a Purple Heart he kept in a drawer. Daniel was 28, quieter than his older brother, but just as dangerous. Jacob was 24, the youngest, still trying to prove he belonged in the family. Business. Marcus Allen Walker was 32 that November, though people who knew him said he looked older, weathered by years that had demanded too much too soon. He stood 6 feet 2 inches with a kind of lean, hard build that came from manual labor and constant tension rather than gym time. His most distinctive feature was a scar that cut through his left eyebrow, a souvenir from a Viet Cong grenade fragment that had missed his eye by 2 inches. The scar gave him a permanent look of anger, like he was always 1 word away from violence. He'd done 2 tours in Vietnam, 67 to 69, came home with a Bronze Star and hands that shook when he drank too much. He worked the stills with his father, drove delivery routes, and handled problems when they arose. When Marcus Walker told you something, you believed him because the alternative was worse. Daniel Robert Walker, 28, was the opposite of his older brother in temperament but equally capable. Where Marcus was explosive, Daniel was calculating. He stood 5 feet 11 inches, built solid, with a methodical way of moving that suggested every action had been thought through 3 steps ahead. He'd avoided Vietnam due to a childhood injury that left him with limited mobility in his left shoulder, a tractor accident when he was 12 that crushed the joint. He couldn't raise his arm above his head, which disqualified him from military service but didn't stop him from being the best shot in the family with a rifle. Daniel kept the books, managed the distribution network, and planned the routes that kept federal agents chasing shadows, while the Walker operation moved 150 gallons a week. Jacob Thomas Walker, 24, was still finding his place in the family hierarchy. He stood 6 feet even, with their father's build and their mother's eyes. What Sam valued most wasn't the money from moonshine, though God knew they needed it with 3 adult sons to support and no legitimate income. What he valued was the idea that a man could still make his own way in the world without bowing to government regulations, bank loans, or corporate bosses. His grandfather, Elijah Walker, had developed their moonshine recipe during Prohibition, back when making liquor was both an act of rebellion and an act of survival. That recipe had kept the Walker family afloat through the Depression, through wars, through every economic catastrophe the 20th century had thrown at the mountains. The secret wasn't just in the corn, though Elijah had perfected the ratio of yellow to white corn after years of experimentation. It wasn't just the fermentation time, though that mattered too. The real secret was the limestone spring water from a specific 40-acre tract of land in Martin's Fork Hollow. Water that filtered through ancient limestone deposits, picking up minerals that created a flavor profile impossible to replicate without knowing the exact source. A subtle note of sweetness and clarity that made Walker moonshine the most sought after in 3 counties. That water source had been in the Walker family since 1887, when Elijah's father had homesteaded the land. 85 years of family history, of sweat and labor, of building something from nothing in mountains that didn't give anything easy. But on October 4th, 1923, Elijah Walker lost that land in a poker game at the Harlan County Courthouse. 5-card draw, $1,000 pot, and a deck that had been marked by Thomas Brennan's father. Witnesses later admitted they'd seen the marks, seen the cheating, but nobody spoke up because the Brennans had money and influence, and the Walkers were just mountain people trying to survive. Thomas Michael Brennan was 55 years old that November. Built thick and strong with a red beard he kept trimmed close and hands missing the tip of his left index finger. Lost to a sawmill accident in 1958. He'd inherited the 40-acre springwater property from his father in 1949, never knowing the full story of how it had been acquired. Or maybe he'd known and hadn't cared. By 1972, Thomas ran his own moonshine operation. Smaller than the Walkers, but profitable enough to support his 4 sons and 6 associates who worked the stills and handled distribution. His sons, Patrick, James, Robert, and Sean, ranged in age from 33 down to 25, all raised in the business, all believing the land was rightfully theirs because the deed said so, and possession was 9/10 of the law. Thomas had noticed discrepancies in his spring's water levels for years, subtle drops that suggested someone was tapping the source upstream. He'd suspected the Walkers but had no proof until September 15th, 1972, when his youngest son Sean followed the underground stream 3/4 of a mile through the woods and found the Walker family's hidden pipeline, copper tubing running from the main spring directly to their still site 2 miles away. The Walkers had been stealing Brennan water for 49 years, ever since losing the land, using it to make the shine that had built their reputation, while the Brennans paid property taxes and maintenance on land they'd thought was exclusively theirs. Thomas Brennan called a family meeting that night. His 4 sons, plus his 6 key associates, Carl Morrison, Pete Hendricks, Mike Donovan, Tom Sullivan, Kevin Reese, and Bobby Crawford. 10 men total, sitting around Thomas's kitchen table, discussing what to do about the Walkers' 49-year theft. The consensus was clear. October 1st, 1972, 2:30 in the afternoon, when temperatures hit 62 degrees and the sky was that particular October blue that made the mountains look painted. Thomas Brennan drove to the Walker property with his 4 sons, parked his truck in the gravel driveway, and walked up to the front porch where Sam Walker sat in a wooden chair, smoking a cigarette. Martha Walker watched from the kitchen window, her hands gripping the sink edge so hard her knuckles went white. The confrontation lasted 11 minutes. Witnesses, including Sam's wife and 2 neighbors who happened to be passing by, later described the exchange to investigators. Thomas spoke first, his voice loud enough to carry across the yard. "We found your pipeline, Sam. 49 years you've been stealing our water. 49 years of theft." Sam didn't stand, didn't raise his voice, just took another drag from his cigarette and said, "That land was stolen from my family in a rigged poker game. My grandfather's sweat is in that ground. Every drop of water you've taken from that spring was ours first." Thomas Brennan's response was measured, cold. "The deed says otherwise. The law says otherwise. You want to dispute it, take it to court, but the stealing stops now. We want $50,000 for the water you've used, or we burn your stills and report you to the feds." Sam Walker stood then, slowly, his limp evident as he put weight on his right leg. He looked at Thomas Brennan, then at the 4 sons standing behind their father, then back to Thomas. "I'll die before I pay you for what's mine." Thomas nodded like he'd expected that answer. "Then you'll die. You've got 2 weeks to think about it. After that, we handle this our way." The Brennan family left the Walker property at 2:41 that afternoon. Martha Walker came out to the porch after they'd gone, found Sam still standing there, staring at the dust their trucks had kicked up. She didn't say anything at first, just stood beside him, this woman who'd been married to him for 30 years, who'd raised 3 sons in the shadow of an illegal business, who'd never complained about the poverty or the danger or the constant fear of federal raids. Finally she spoke, her voice quiet but firm. "Let it go, Sam. It's just land. It's not worth dying over." Sam looked at her, and she saw something in his eyes she'd never seen before, something that made her step back. "It's not just land, Martha. It's everything my grandfather built, everything my father lost. If I let this stand, what am I? What kind of man leaves his sons a legacy of cowardice?" She tried again, desperate now. "You'll leave them no legacy at all if you're dead or in prison. Think about Marcus, about Daniel, about Jacob. Think about what this will do to them." But Sam had already made his decision. You could see it in the set of his shoulders, the way his jaw tightened. "I am thinking about them. I'm thinking they deserve to hold their heads up, to know their father didn't back down when thieves came calling." Over the next 2 weeks, the Walker family prepared, not for negotiation, not for compromise, but for war. Sam called a family meeting on October 15th, a Sunday evening when the temperature had dropped to 43 degrees and frost was starting to form on the grass. The 4 Walker men sat around the kitchen table, the same table where Sam had eaten breakfast every morning for 30 years, where his sons had done homework as children, where family decisions had always been made. Martha Walker stood in the doorway between the kitchen and living room, listening but not participating. She knew what was coming, had known since the moment Thomas Brennan drove away 2 weeks earlier. Sam spoke first, his voice calm, measured, the way he always sounded when he'd made up his mind about something. The Brennans want $50,000 for water that's rightfully ours. They're threatening to burn our stills and bring federal agents down on us. We've got 2 days before their deadline. Marcus leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking under his weight. We could pay them. We've got maybe 30,000 saved. Could borrow the rest. Sam shook his head. Paying them says they're right. Says the land is theirs. Says my grandfather deserved to lose everything to a marked deck and a rigged game. I won't do that. I won't dishonor his memory that way. Daniel, always the practical one, spoke next. If we don't pay, they'll make good on their threats. We'll lose the stills, lose the business, possibly go to federal prison. Is the principal worth that? It was Jacob who answered, the youngest son finally finding his voice in family matters. It's not about principle. It's about who we are. If we back down now, we're saying any man with a piece of paper can take what's ours. We're saying might makes right, and the Brennans have more might. Sam looked at his youngest son with something like pride. Exactly. This isn't about money or business. It's about whether the Walker family stands for something or falls for anything. Martha spoke then, her voice cutting through the testosterone and bravado. You're talking about killing them. Don't dress it up in honor and legacy. You're planning murder. Sam turned to face his wife. I'm planning justice. There's a difference. Martha left the room then, couldn't bear to hear the rest. Went upstairs to the bedroom she'd shared with Sam for 3 decades and sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the murmur of male voices below, planning violence in the same kitchen where she'd baked birthday cakes and canned vegetables and tried to build a normal life in abnormal circumstances. Downstairs, the planning continued. Marcus, with his military training, took charge of logistics. We know their operation. We've been watching them for years, same as they've been watching us. Thomas Brennan and his 4 sons, plus 6 associates, 10 men total. They run 2 still sites, one in Clover Fork, one up near Layden Trail. They rotate shifts, 3 men per location, rotating every 8 hours. Daniel pulled out a notebook, started sketching a map from memory. Thomas lives at the main property, the 40 acres. His sons live within 2 miles. The associates are scattered, some in Harlan proper, some in the hollers. If we're doing this, we do it systematically. Take out the associates first, then the sons, then Thomas last. Make him know it's coming. Jacob asked the question that needed asking. Are we sure about this? Once we start, there's no going back. We'll either finish it or die trying. Sam Walker looked at each of his sons in turn. Marcus with his war scars and shaking hands. Daniel with his calculating mind and damaged shoulder. Jacob with his youth and desperate need to prove himself worthy of the family name. I'm sure. This debt has been hanging over our family for 49 years. It ends now, one way or another. But I need to know you're with me, all of you. Because if we do this, we do it together, and we live with the consequences together. The 3 sons looked at each other, some unspoken communication passing between them. November 12, 1972, began like any other Sunday in Harlan County. Temperature at 4 in the morning was 34 degrees, fog thick enough that you couldn't see 20 feet in any direction. Patrick Michael Brennan, 29 years old, oldest son of Thomas Brennan, woke at 4:15 in his small house on Kentucky Route 421, 3 miles from his father's main property. He made coffee, instant Folgers because he'd never learned to work a percolator, and smoked 2 Marlboros while staring out his kitchen window at nothing but gray fog. His shift at the Clover Fork Still site started at 5, which meant leaving the house by 4:30 to navigate the narrow dirt road that wound 2 miles up into the hollow. Patrick had been working his father's moonshine operation since he was 16, 13 years of mixing mash, monitoring temperatures, running product down mountain roads with his headlights off. He was good at it, methodical and careful, never took unnecessary risks. He had a wife, Jennifer, 26, and 2 daughters, ages 4 and 6. The girls were still asleep upstairs. Jennifer stirred when Patrick kissed her goodbye at 4:28, mumbled something he didn't catch, went back to sleep. He'd never see her conscious again. Patrick's truck, a 1968 Ford F-100, coughed to life in the driveway. He let it warm up for 2 minutes, watching the fog swirl in his headlight beams, then pulled out onto the empty highway. The drive to Clover Fork took 18 minutes on a clear day. In this fog, it would take 25. He turned off Route 421 onto the unmarked dirt road at 4:41, his truck's suspension groaning as it hit the first ruts. The road climbed steadily, switchbacking up the mountainside barely wide enough for one vehicle. Pine trees pressed close on both sides, their branches occasionally scraping the truck's paint. Patrick had made this drive hundreds of times, knew every turn, every pothole, could probably do it with his eyes closed. At 4:53, he reached the clearing where the still operation was hidden, a quarter-acre space carved out of the forest, surrounded by thick undergrowth that made it invisible from above. The still itself sat under a crude wooden shelter, copper coils gleaming dully in the fog. Patrick parked his truck, killed the engine, sat for a moment finishing the cigarette he'd lit halfway up the mountain. The fog was even thicker up here, visibility maybe 10 feet. He could hear water dripping from the trees, the faint trickle of the creek that fed the still, nothing else. No birds yet, too early. No wind, just that peculiar mountain silence that felt like being wrapped in cotton. Marcus Walker had been lying prone on a ridge 200 yards from the clearing since 3:45 that morning. He'd hiked in from the opposite side of the mountain, a 2-hour climb in the dark, carrying his rifle and a thermos of coffee his mother had made without knowing what it was for. The rifle was a Remington 700 .30-06 caliber, the same model he'd used in Vietnam for long-range work. He'd zeroed the scope yesterday afternoon, shooting at targets 300 yards out, adjusting until he could put 3 shots in a 2-inch group. The fog complicated things, but Marcus had learned patience in rice paddies and jungle clearings. He controlled his breathing, slowed his heart rate, became part of the landscape. Through his scope, he watched Patrick Brennan exit his truck, stretch, light another cigarette. Watched him walk toward the still, his back to Marcus's position. The first shot had to count. If Patrick made it to cover, if he had time to grab the shotgun they kept by the still, this got complicated. Marcus exhaled slowly, settled the crosshairs on the center of Patrick's back, between the shoulder blades, squeezed the trigger with steady pressure, no jerking, just like the Marines had taught him. The rifle bucked against his shoulder. The sound echoed across the hollow, flat and final. Patrick Brennan dropped where he stood, his cigarette falling from his fingers, his body hitting the ground with the boneless collapse of instant death. The .30-06 round had entered between his shoulder blades, traveled through his heart and left lung, exited through his chest. He was dead before his brain could process what happened. Marcus worked the bolt, chambered another round, kept the scope on Patrick's body for 2 full minutes, watching for any movement. There was none. He packed up his rifle, the empty brass casing in his pocket, and began the 2-hour hike back down the mountain the way he'd come. He reached his truck, parked 4 miles away on a logging road at 7:05, drove home on back roads 55 miles per hour, obeying every traffic law. Arrived at the Walker property at 7:40. His father was sitting on the front porch, drinking coffee. Marcus walked up the steps, set his rifle inside the door, sat down in the chair next to Sam. Neither man spoke for several minutes. Finally, Sam asked, "It's done?" Marcus nodded. "Patrick Brennan, clean shot. He didn't suffer." Sam took a sip of his coffee, stared out at the mountains. "Good. That's 1. 9 more to go." Jennifer Brennan found her husband's body at 7:15 that morning. She'd woken at 6:30, realized Patrick hadn't called like he usually did when he reached the still site, drove up to check on him. She saw his truck first, then his body lying face down in the clearing. Blood pooled around him, already starting to congeal in the cold morning air. Her screams brought no one, the nearest house 3 miles away. But she managed to drive back down the mountain and call the sheriff's department from a gas station payphone on Route 421. Sheriff Dale Perkins arrived at the scene at 8:05, took one look at the body, the bullet wound, the professional nature of the kill, and knew this wasn't a random hunting accident or a dispute gone wrong. This was execution. By 9 that morning, Thomas Brennan had been notified that his oldest son was dead. He gathered his remaining 3 sons and 6 associates at his property, everyone armed, everyone angry, but nobody yet understanding the scope of what was coming. The second death happened at 11:43 that same morning. James Robert Brennan, 33, second oldest of Thomas's sons, was driving on Route 421 heading toward Harlan to meet with one of their distributors. The road curved sharply around Black Mountain, a notorious stretch where dozens of accidents had happened over the years. Daniel Walker had been parked on a logging road a quarter mile ahead since 10:30, waiting with patience that came from years of stalking deer in these same mountains. He'd brought a length of steel cable, 3/8 inch thick, and a come-along winch. At 11:35, he stretched the cable across the road at bumper height, secured it to 2 trees on either side, hidden in the undergrowth. When James Brennan's truck came around the curve at 45 miles per hour, the cable caught the front bumper, tore it clean off, and sent the truck spinning sideways. The vehicle left the road, rolled twice, down the embankment, came to rest upside down against an oak tree. Daniel waited 5 minutes, approached the wreck with a tire iron. James Brennan was still alive, trapped in the crushed cab, bleeding from a head wound, semi-conscious. Daniel looked at him through the shattered windshield, saw the recognition in James's eyes, saw him try to say something. Daniel didn't speak, just walked back to his truck, removed the cable and winch, drove away. James Brennan died from internal bleeding 40 minutes later, before anyone found the wreck. The third death was Carl Morrison, 41, one of the Brennan associates who'd worked for Thomas for 18 years. Carl ran the second still site up near Layden Trail, usually worked the afternoon shift from noon to 8. At 1:15 that afternoon, while Carl was checking the temperature on the mash barrels, the still exploded. The blast was heard 2 miles away, a percussion that rattled windows and sent birds scattering from trees. Investigators would later determine that someone had loosened the pressure relief valve and tampered with the thermometer to read 20 degrees cooler than actual temperature. The result was a steam explosion that sent shrapnel and boiling mash in a 15-foot radius. Carl Morrison was killed instantly, his body so badly burned that dental records were needed for identification. Jacob Walker, who'd spent the previous night learning the layout of the Layden Trail site, was 20 miles away when the explosion happened, having breakfast at a diner in Middlesboro with witnesses who could place him there. By 2 that afternoon, 3 men were dead. Thomas Brennan finally understood this wasn't random, wasn't coincidence. The Walkers were eliminating his entire operation. He called Sheriff Perkins, demanded protection, demanded arrests. But Perkins had no evidence, no witnesses, and a jurisdiction that covered 476 square miles with only 8 deputies. He told Thomas to stay at his property, stay armed, and he'd do what he could. It wasn't enough. At 4:37 that afternoon, Pete Hendricks, 38, another Brennan associate, was working on his truck in his driveway in Evarts when a rifle shot from 600 yards away struck him in the chest. Marcus Walker, firing from a ridge overlooking the town, made the shot with the same Remington 700 he'd used that morning. Pete Hendricks died on his front lawn, while his wife screamed for help that arrived too late. At 6:15, as darkness fell and temperatures dropped to 29 degrees, Robert Brennan, 27, Thomas's third son, was shot through his kitchen window while eating dinner. The bullet came from 250 yards out, through the window, through Robert's skull, embedding in the wall behind him. His wife, pregnant with their first child, found him slumped over his plate, the back of his head gone, blood and brain matter on the wallpaper. At 8:03 that evening, Mike Donovan, 44, one of the original Brennan crew members, was found dead in his work shed behind his house in Cumberland. Carbon monoxide poisoning, the door blocked from outside, his truck's engine running in the enclosed space. Daniel Walker had rigged it to look like suicide, even left a note he'd forged using samples of Mike's handwriting from delivery receipts. The note mentioned depression, money problems, made no mention of the Brennans or the war that was erasing them. The 6th death of November 12th happened at 9:47. Tom Sullivan, 39, was walking home from the bar in Harlan, a route he took every Saturday night. Half a mile from the bar to his rental house, he never made it. His body was found the next morning in Clover Creek, 300 yards from the road. Drowning, the medical examiner would say, though the bruising on the back of his skull suggested he'd been knocked unconscious first. Jacob Walker had followed him from the bar, waited until Tom was crossing the bridge, struck him from behind with a tire iron, thrown him into the creek. The current did the rest. November 12th ended with 6 dead. The Brennan family and their associates were being systematically destroyed, and law enforcement was powerless to stop it. November 13th dawned cold and clear. Temperature at sunrise a brutal 26 degrees. Frost covering everything like a death shroud. Thomas Brennan hadn't slept. He'd spent the night at his property with his 2 remaining sons, Sean and Kevin, plus his 3 surviving associates, Bobby Crawford, Kevin Reese, and Michael Torres. 7 men total, down from 10 the previous morning, barricaded in Thomas's house with enough weapons to fight a small war. Shotguns, rifles, pistols, ammunition stacked in boxes in every room. They'd pushed furniture against windows, set up watch rotations, prepared for siege. Sheriff Perkins had stationed 2 deputies on the main road leading to the property. But everyone knew that was theater. If the Walkers wanted to get to the Brennans, 2 deputies wouldn't stop them. At 7:30 that morning, Thomas tried calling Sam Walker. The phone rang 12 times before Martha answered. Her voice was quiet, strained. "They're not here, Thomas. They left before dawn. I don't know where they went." Thomas Brennan felt something cold settle in his chest. "You tell your husband this. He's murdered 6 people. 6 men with families, with children. Whatever grievance he thinks he has, this has gone beyond any possible justification. There's no coming back from this." Martha Walker's response was barely a whisper. "I know. I told him that. He wouldn't listen. I'm sorry, Thomas. I'm so sorry for what's happening." She hung up before he could respond. The Walkers were methodical that day, working from a list, checking off names. At 9:05, Bobby Crawford, 32, one of the Brennan associates, was shot while pumping gas at a station in Harlan. The bullet came from a parking lot 400 yards away, struck Bobby in the chest, killed him before he hit the ground. Witnesses saw a blue pickup truck leaving the area at high speed, but couldn't get a plate number. At 11:20, Kevin Reese, 36, was driving toward the Brennan property when his truck's brakes failed on a steep downhill section of Route 421. The vehicle accelerated to 70 miles per hour, missed a curve, went through a guardrail, dropped 200 feet into a ravine. Kevin died on impact. State police investigators would later find that the brake line had been cut most of the way through, just enough metal left that it would fail under heavy braking. Someone who knew vehicles, who understood exactly how to make death look like mechanical failure. At 2:15 that afternoon, Michael Torres, 29, the last of the non-family Brennan associates, was found dead in his apartment in Cumberland. Single gunshot to the head, the door unlocked, no signs of struggle. The medical examiner estimated time of death around noon, which meant he'd been killed while Thomas Brennan and his sons were locked in their fortress 3 miles away. By 3 that afternoon, only 4 Brennans remained. Thomas, 55, and his 3 sons, Sean, 25, Kevin, 31, and the realization that had set in that morning hardened into certainty. They were all going to die. The Walkers weren't going to stop until every person connected to the disputed land was eliminated. Thomas Brennan sat at his kitchen table, the same table where he'd eaten thousands of meals, where his sons had grown from boys to men, and tried to think of a way out. Running meant abandoning everything, and even then, the Walkers might follow. Surrendering the land wouldn't work because 6 people were already dead, and you couldn't undo that. Going to law enforcement meant admitting to federal crimes, and the Walkers would just wait until they got out of prison. There was no exit, no negotiation, no survival. At 4:03, Thomas called Sam Walker's number again. This time Sam answered, his voice calm, almost pleasant, like they were discussing the weather. "Thomas, you've killed 9 people, Sam. 9 men who had families, who had lives. My sons, my friends. How do you live with yourself?" Sam Walker's response was quiet but firm. "The same way your father lived with himself after he stole my family's land in a rigged poker game. The same way you lived with yourself, knowing that land was never rightfully yours. How many years did you profit from our water, Thomas?" 49. "How many times did you think about making it right?" Never. You want to talk about morality now, when it's your blood being spilled? It's too late for that conversation. Thomas Brennan felt rage and despair in equal measure. "What do you want, Sam? You want the land? Take it. I'll sign the deed over right now. You want money? I'll give you everything I have. Just stop this. Please. My boys don't deserve this." "Your boys are as guilty as you are," Sam replied. "They've been using stolen water same as you, profiting from theft same as you. There's only one way this ends, Thomas. You know that." The line went dead. Thomas looked at his 3 remaining sons, saw fear and resignation in their eyes. Sean, the youngest, barely 25, who'd talked about leaving Kentucky, maybe going to college. Kevin, 31, who had a girlfriend in Harlan, who'd been planning to propose at Christmas. These were his children, and his father's crime from 49 years ago was going to cost them their lives. At 6:30 that evening, as full darkness fell and temperatures dropped to 24 degrees, the Walkers came. All 4 of them, Sam and his 3 sons, armed and methodical, approaching the Brennan property from 3 sides. They'd cut the phone lines first, then the power. The Brennan fortress, suddenly dark, except for flashlights and the faint glow of a kerosene lamp, became a tomb waiting to be sealed. The firefight began at 7:05. Marcus Walker, approaching from the north through the woods, fired the first shot through a window, not trying to hit anyone, just announcing their presence. The response was immediate. Shotgun and rifle fire from multiple windows, muzzle flashes, lighting up the dark house like a deadly Christmas display. For 20 minutes, the Brennans held their ground, firing at shadows, at sounds, at nothing. But the Walkers had patience and training. They surrounded the house, waited for the Brennans to waste ammunition on ghosts. Daniel Walker, positioned on the east side, had brought 2 Molotov cocktails, bottles filled with gasoline and strips of cloth. At 7:23, he threw the first one through a window on the ground floor. The bottle shattered. Flames spread across the hardwood floor. Smoke began filling the house. The second Molotov followed 2 minutes later, thrown into a different window. Now the Brennans had a choice: burn or run. They chose to run. Sean Brennan, the youngest, came out first at 7:28, bursting through the front door with a shotgun, firing wildly into the darkness. Jacob Walker, positioned 15 yards from the porch, shot him twice with a deer rifle. Sean dropped on the front steps, the shotgun clattering away, his blood black in the firelight. He tried to crawl back inside, made it 2 feet before the second wound took him. He died on his father's porch, 25 years old. His last breath a mixture of smoke and blood. Kevin Brennan came next, running from the back door toward the barn, hoping to reach a vehicle, to escape into the night. Marcus Walker, who'd been waiting for exactly that move, shot him from 40 yards away. The bullet struck Kevin in the back, spun him around, dropped him face up in the dirt between the house and barn. He was still alive when Marcus approached, still conscious enough to recognize his killer. "Please," Kevin whispered, blood bubbling from his lips. "Please. I didn't do anything. The land, the game, that was before I was born." Marcus looked down at him with eyes that had seen too much death to be moved by one more plea. "And Patrick Brennan didn't do anything either. Neither did my grandfather when your grandfather cheated him. We all pay for our father's sins eventually." He fired once more, and Kevin Brennan's pleading stopped. Thomas Brennan, the last one alive, came out of the burning house at 7:36, not running, not fighting, just walking slowly through the front door with his hands empty and raised. Sam Walker was waiting for him, had been waiting for 49 years for this moment. The two men, both in their 50s, both fathers who'd watched their sons die for a debt neither had created, stood 10 feet apart while Thomas's house burned behind him. "It's done, Sam," Thomas said, his voice hoarse from smoke. "You've murdered 10 people. You've destroyed 2 families. Are you satisfied? Does this balance the scales?" Sam Walker looked at the man whose father had destroyed his grandfather, whose family had prospered on stolen land for half a century. He should have felt triumph, vindication, justice finally served. Instead, he felt empty, hollowed out, like the revenge he'd craved for so long had consumed everything inside him and left nothing but ash. "No," Sam admitted. "It doesn't balance anything. It just ends it." Thomas Brennan nodded, understanding passing between them, 2 men who'd both lost everything to pride and principle and the inability to let the past die peacefully. "Then end it," Thomas said. "I'm tired. My boys are dead. There's nothing left." Sam Walker raised his rifle. Behind him, his 3 sons watched. Marcus with his war-damaged nerves, Daniel with his calculating mind, Jacob with his desperate need for approval. All of them accomplices now, all of them murderers, all of them bound together by blood and violence and a land dispute that should have been settled in a courtroom instead of a graveyard. "I'm sorry it came to this," Sam said, and meant it. "I'm sorry too," Thomas Brennan replied. "But sorry doesn't bring them back, does it? Doesn't undo what's been done. Doesn't make either of us anything but killers." Sam pulled the trigger. Thomas Brennan fell, the last of his line, dead before he hit the ground that his father had won in a poker game 49 years earlier. The house continued to burn behind him, flames reaching 60 feet into the November sky, smoke visible for miles. By the time the fire department arrived from Harlan 35 minutes later, there was nothing left but foundation and ash and 3 bodies in the yard. The Walker family stood together at the edge of the property, watching it burn, not speaking, not moving, just four men who'd crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Sam thought about his grandfather, about the shame that had broken his father, about the legacy he'd just passed to his sons. He'd defended the family honor, protected their heritage, ensured the Walker name would be remembered. But at what cost? His boys were murderers now, same as him. There was no going back, no redemption, just the slow march toward inevitable justice. November 16th, 1972, 6:43 in the morning. Temperature 28 degrees. Sky the color of old pewter. Frost covering the Walker property like evidence of the night's guilt. Kentucky State Police Captain James Morrison arrived with 17 officers, 6 vehicles, and a warrant for 4 arrests. They'd expected resistance, maybe a standoff, possibly a shootout that would add more bodies to a count that already stood at 10. What they found instead were 4 men sitting on the front porch of a modest house, dressed in work clothes, drinking coffee like it was any other Tuesday morning. Sam Walker in the center, his 3 sons flanking him, all of them armed but with weapons laid across their laps, not pointed at anyone. Waiting. They'd been waiting since 5 that morning, since the fire at the Brennan property had finally burned itself out, since the last sirens had faded, and the reality of what they'd done settled like concrete in their chests. Martha Walker was inside, crying quietly in the bedroom she'd shared with Sam for 30 years. She'd packed his things already, a small bag with clothes and his Bible, knowing he wouldn't be coming home, knowing her sons wouldn't be coming home either. Captain Morrison approached slowly, his service weapon drawn but pointed at the ground, trying to read the situation, to understand if this was surrender or suicide by cop. He'd been a state trooper for 23 years, had worked murders and drug busts and domestic violence calls that ended in blood, but he'd never seen anything like the scene at the Brennan property. 10 bodies across 4 days, some shot from distance with military precision, some killed in close combat, some eliminated with cold calculation that suggested planning and intent. The FBI had been notified, were sending agents from Lexington, but Morrison had jurisdiction, and he was taking the caller. "Sam Walker," he called out, stopping 30 feet from the porch. "You and your sons are under arrest for the murders of Thomas Brennan, Patrick Brennan, James Brennan, Robert Brennan, Sean Brennan, Kevin Brennan, Carl Morrison, Pete Hendricks, Mike Donovan, Tom Sullivan, Bobby Crawford, Kevin Reese, and Michael Torres. Put down your weapons and place your hands on your heads." Sam Walker set his rifle down gently, stood with the stiffness of a man whose body hurt from 4 days of violence and 49 years of carrying rage. His sons followed suit, standing, setting weapons aside, raising their hands. No drama, no final speeches, no last stand. Just compliance, like they'd known this moment was coming since the first shot was fired on November 12th. "The land is ours now," Sam said quietly, his voice carrying across the frost-covered yard. "My grandsons will use that water legally, without shame, without owing anyone for what's rightfully theirs. That's all I wanted." Captain Morrison gestured to his officers, who moved forward with handcuffs and caution. "Sam, you killed 13 people. 10, Sam corrected. "We killed 10, the Brennans and their associates. 10 thieves who built their lives on stolen property. The law doesn't see it that way, Morrison said, watching as his officers cuffed the Walker men, patted them down, found no additional weapons. The law will see you as murderers. The worst kind, the planned kind. The kind that hunts people down over days. Sam nodded, accepting this. Maybe so. But mountain law is older than state law, Captain. You know that. You grew up here. You understand what it means when a man's legacy is stolen. Morrison did understand, had grown up in these same mountains, knew the codes that governed Harlan County long before courts and constitutions. But understanding wasn't the same as excusing. I understand. But understanding doesn't change what happens next. You're going to prison, Sam. All of you. For the rest of your lives. They loaded the Walker men into separate vehicles, standard procedure for multiple suspects, prevent them from coordinating stories. Marcus in the first car, his hands cuffed behind his back, staring out the window at the property he'd never see free again. Daniel in the second, his face expressionless, mind already working on legal strategies that wouldn't matter. Jacob in the third, youngest and most devastated, tears running down his face as reality crashed over him. Sam, in the last vehicle, sitting beside Captain Morrison, watching his home disappear as they drove down the gravel driveway toward Route 421. Martha stood on the porch, watched them take her entire family, her husband and all 3 sons, away in police cars. Neighbors had gathered at the property line, drawn by the sirens and the rumors that had been spreading since the Brennan house burned. Some looked sympathetic, understanding the mountain code that had driven Sam Walker to violence. Others looked horrified, seeing only a man who'd murdered 10 people over a land dispute that could have been settled in court. The truth, as always, was somewhere in between. The ride to the Harlan County Jail took 18 minutes. Morrison didn't speak much, just watched Sam in the rear-view mirror, this man who'd seemed so ordinary for 58 years, who'd raised a family and run a business and gone to church on Sundays, who'd then executed 10 people with methodical precision. You know this won't bring peace, Morrison said finally. Killing them didn't solve anything. Didn't get your land back legally, didn't honor your grandfather. Just created more pain, more death, more families destroyed. Sam looked out the window at the mountains passing by, these hills he'd known his entire life, that his family had worked for 4 generations. I know. I knew it when I started. But some debts can't be settled with money or lawyers or time. Some things a man has to answer for, even if the answer destroys him. And your sons? Morrison asked. They had to answer too? Marcus could have had a life after Vietnam. Daniel had a mind that could have done anything. Jacob was just 24, his whole life ahead of him. You took that from them. This hit harder than any accusation of murder. Sam closed his eyes, saw his boys as children, saw the men he'd turned them into, killers before they were 30, prisoners for the rest of their lives. They chose to stand with me. Gave them the choice. Some choice, Morrison said bitterly. Stand with your father or abandon him. What son could walk away from that? They arrived at the jail at 7:35. News crews were already setting up, word having spread that the Harlan County Massacre suspects were in custody. The story would dominate Kentucky news for months, would become legend in Appalachia, would be debated in bars and churches and courtrooms for decades. Were the Walkers murderers or men driven to extremes By a justice system that couldn't address generational theft? Both, probably. Always both. The booking process took 3 hours. Fingerprints, photographs, medical checks, property inventory. The Walker men were separated, placed in individual cells, denied contact with each other or anyone else except their court-appointed attorneys. Sam Walker sat on a concrete bunk in a 6x8 cell and thought about his grandfather, Elijah, about the poker game in 1923, about 49 years of shame that had ended in 10 deaths and 4 life sentences. He'd defended his family's honor. He'd also destroyed his family's future. Both things were true. Both things would haunt him for whatever years remained. The trial began on March 5th, 1973, in the Harlan County Courthouse, the same building where Elijah Walker had lost his land 50 years earlier. The courtroom held 200 people, but demand for seats exceeded capacity by 10 times. National media covered it, reporters from New York and Chicago, trying to understand the mountain codes that made 10 murders seem like justice to half the county. Judge Robert Harrison presided, a Kentucky native who understood both the law and the culture that had produced this case. The prosecution was led by Commonwealth Attorney Michael Chen, 38, ambitious and thorough, seeing the Walker case as his ticket to higher office. The defense was handled by 4 court-appointed attorneys, none of whom had ever handled a capital murder case before, none of whom really wanted to. The Walker family had no money for private counsel, their assets seized, their business destroyed. Sam, Marcus, Daniel, and Jacob sat at the defense table in identical gray suits purchased by the county, looking uncomfortable in formal wear, looking even more uncomfortable with the reality of their situation. Behind them, Martha Walker sat every day for 6 weeks, her face aged 10 years in 4 months, watching her family face justice. The prosecution's case was straightforward and devastating. 10 bodies, forensic evidence linking the Walkers to each death, witnesses who'd seen vehicles matching the Walkers near crime scenes, and most damning physical evidence collected from the Walker property. Shell casings that matched bullets recovered from bodies, the Molotov bottles remnants with fingerprints, the tools used to cut brake lines and rig explosions. Chen laid it out methodically, building a timeline that showed premeditation, planning, systematic execution. Each day brought new horror, new details. Crime scene photographs that made jurors gasp, medical examiner testimony about suffering and death, family members of victims who took the stand and wept while describing their loss. Jennifer Brennan, Patrick's widow, described finding her husband's body, her 2 daughters asking when Daddy was coming home. She looked directly at Sam Walker while she testified, her voice steady despite tears. "You didn't just kill Patrick. You killed our future, our family, everything we were building. For what? For land? For pride? Was it worth it?" Sam met her gaze but said nothing, couldn't say anything, because the honest answer was no, it wasn't worth it. But that wouldn't bring Patrick back. The defense strategy was problematic from the start. They couldn't deny the murders, the evidence was overwhelming. They couldn't claim self-defense, the victims had been hunted, not confronted. What they tried to argue was diminished capacity due to generational trauma, the psychological impact of inherited shame, the mountain code that demanded blood for blood. They brought in psychiatrists who testified about Sam Walker's mental state, about how the poker game loss had been passed down through 3 generations like a genetic disorder, how economic desperation and cultural isolation had created a mindset where violence seemed like the only option. They presented evidence of the rigged poker game, found documentation from 1923 that suggested the Brennan family had indeed cheated, that the land had been stolen. But none of that justified murder. The prosecution made that clear in cross-examination after cross-examination. Even if the land was stolen, Chen argued, even if the poker game was rigged, even if every word of the defense's historical narrative is true, does that give anyone the right to execute 10 people? Is that how we settle property disputes in America, with rifles and fire and systematic elimination? The defense had no good answer. Marcus Walker took the stand on March 23rd against his attorney's advice, needing to explain why he'd killed 6 people with military precision. He described Vietnam, described learning to kill efficiently, described coming home to a county with no jobs and no future, described his father's pain over the stolen land. It wasn't about property value, Marcus testified, his voice flat, emotionless, the same tone he'd used to report confirmed kills in Vietnam. It was about who we were, about our family's place in these mountains. The Brennans built their reputation on our water, on our grandfather's shame. We couldn't let that stand. Chen's cross-examination was brutal. So you shot Patrick Brennan in the back while he walked to work? You shot Pete Hendricks in his own driveway? You shot Kevin Brennan while he begged for his life? And you want this jury to believe that was about family honor? Marcus had no answer that didn't make him sound like exactly what he was, a trained killer who'd turned those skills on civilians. Daniel Walker didn't testify, his attorney, convincing him that his intelligence would work against him, that his careful planning would demonstrate premeditation too clearly. Jacob Walker did testify, the youngest, the most sympathetic, his attorney hoping the jury might see him as a son who'd been manipulated by a domineering father. But Jacob's testimony backfired when he admitted he'd killed Sean Brennan, admitted he'd thrown Tom Sullivan into the creek, admitted he'd done these things willingly, proudly, believing he was honoring his family. Sam Walker testified last on April 2nd, the courtroom packed with spectators wanting to hear the patriarch explain the inexplicable. He was calm, measured, unrepentant. He described the 1923 poker game in detail, described growing up watching his father drink himself to death over shame, described building a moonshine business on water his family should have owned legally. He described the Brennan ultimatum, the choice between paying for stolen land or losing everything. I couldn't pay them, Sam testified, not because I didn't have the money, though I didn't, but because paying meant admitting they were right, meant my grandfather deserved to lose, meant my father's pain was justified. I couldn't do that to his memory. Chen asked the question everyone wanted answered. So you killed 10 people to protect your grandfather's memory? That's your justification? Sam looked at the jury. 12 people from Harlan County who understood these mountains, who probably knew families like the Walkers and Brennans. I killed 10 people because they built their lives on theft and refused to make it right. I gave them chances to settle it peacefully. They chose otherwise. In the mountains, when the law won't help you, you help yourself. The jury deliberated for 14 hours, from April 9th at 10 in the morning until April 10th at midnight. When they returned, every walker was convicted on all counts. 10 counts of first-degree murder each for Sam, Marcus, and Daniel. 7 counts for Jacob, the jury accepting that he hadn't participated in the first 3 killings. Sentencing came 2 weeks later. Judge Harrison spoke for 20 minutes before announcing the sentences, his voice heavy with the weight of what he had to do. This court recognizes the historical grievance, recognizes the cultural context, recognizes that the Brennan family may indeed have benefited from theft. But recognition is not excuse. The law exists so that we don't settle our disputes with violence, so that property claims don't become blood feuds, so that we are civilized rather than savage. Sam Walker, I sentence you to 10 consecutive life terms without possibility of parole. Marcus Walker, Daniel Walker, the same. Jacob Walker, 7 consecutive life terms with possibility of parole. After 40 years, the courtroom erupted, some in approval, some in outrage. Martha Walker's wail cutting through the noise as she watched her entire family sentenced to die in prison. The aftermath of the Kentucky Moonshine Massacre rippled through 2 families and dozens of connected lives with the force of the violence that created it. The Brennan family, what remained of it, scattered like shrapnel from an explosion, seeking distance from the ground that had soaked up so much blood. Thomas Brennan's widow, Catherine, 52 years old when her husband and 4 sons were murdered, never recovered. She'd lost her entire male family in 4 days, attended 5 funerals in 1 week, stood at 5 graves, and tried to make sense of violence that had no sense. She sold the 40-acre property in July 1973 for $20,000, a fraction of its value, to a development company that had no connection to moonshine or mountain feuds. She moved to Louisville, lived with her sister, existed rather than lived for 16 years. Neighbors said she never smiled again, never celebrated holidays, never stopped wearing black. She died in March 1989, officially from a stroke, but everyone who knew her understood she died in November 1972 and just taken 17 years to stop breathing. Patrick Brennan's widow, Jennifer, 26 when her husband was murdered, was left with 2 daughters ages 4 and 6 and no income. The moonshine business had provided well, but left nothing legal, no life insurance, no pension, no safety net. She moved back to her parents' house in Pineville, worked as a waitress for minimum wage plus tips, watched her daughters grow up without their father. The girls, Amy and Sarah, carried the weight of their father's murder through childhood, through adolescence, into adulthood. Amy, the oldest, developed anxiety disorder by age 12, dropped out of high school at 16, married young to escape her mother's grief-filled house, divorced by 23. Sarah, the youngest, who barely remembered her father, did better on paper, finished high school, got a job at a bank, but struggled with trust, with anger, with the question that haunted all the Brennan survivors. Why? Why had her father's life been worth less than a land dispute? Jennifer Brennan never remarried, never dated, stayed frozen at 26 for the rest of her life. She visited Patrick's grave every Sunday for 41 years until her own death in 2013, cancer that had been building as long as her grief. James Brennan's widow, Rachel, 30 years old with 3 children under 10, faced similar devastation. She'd begged James not to work for his father, not to get involved in the moonshine business, had wanted a normal life away from the illegal operation that she'd always known would end badly. Just not this badly. Not with her husband dead at 33, his truck crushed around him while he bled out alone on a mountain road. Rachel moved to Lexington, changed her last name, tried to give her children a fresh start. But trauma doesn't respect geography. Her oldest son, James Jr., became obsessed with the murders, read every newspaper article, every court document, tried to understand why his father had to die. He confronted Sam Walker in prison once, in 1991, asked him directly, "My father was 26 when he started working for his uncle. He was born in 1939, didn't even exist when the poker game happened. Why did he have to die for something that happened before he was born?" Sam Walker had looked at him through the prison glass and said, "I ask myself the same question every day. I don't have an answer that makes it right." Robert Brennan's widow, Lisa, pregnant when her husband was shot through their kitchen window, gave birth to a son 3 months later. She named him Robert Jr., a memorial to the father who'd never meet him. She never told the boy how his father died until he was 16. Couldn't find words to explain that Daddy had been murdered over a property dispute, that his blood had decorated the wallpaper while his unborn son grew in his wife's belly. Robert Jr. grew up angry, directionless, the hole where his father should have been filled with resentment and unanswered questions. He died in a motorcycle accident at 23, 1995, and Lisa buried her son next to her husband. 2 graves side by side. 2 Roberts, who never got to know each other. Sean Brennan, the youngest son, 25 when he died on his father's porch, had been engaged to a girl named Michelle. They'd planned a June wedding, had sent out invitations, had picked out a house to rent in Harlan. Michelle waited 2 years before she started dating again, 5 years before she married someone else, a quiet man from Lexington who knew nothing about moonshine or mountain feuds. But she never forgot Sean, kept his photograph in a drawer, looked at it sometimes and wondered what their life would have been if 40 acres and a poker game hadn't mattered more than his future. The 6 associates, the men who'd worked for the Brennans but weren't family, left behind 17 children between them. 17 kids who grew up without fathers, who carried the stigma of the massacre through school, through jobs, through life. Carl Morrison's 3 daughters, ages 8, 6, and 4, when their father died in the Still explosion, were raised by their mother on welfare and charity. The oldest, Rebecca, became a nurse, dedicated her life to saving people because she couldn't save her father. The middle daughter, Jennifer, struggled with addiction, in and out of rehab, self-medicating the trauma she'd never processed. The youngest, Sarah, had no memories of her father except what others told her, grew up with a hole she couldn't name. Pete Hendrix's 4 sons, ranging from 12 to 6, when their father was shot in the driveway, watched it happen, were playing in the yard. When the bullet struck, saw their father fall, couldn't understand why or how or who. the oldest, David, became a state trooper, spent his career trying to prevent what happened to his family from happening to others. The trauma replicated itself through generations, the massacre's legacy written in broken lives and damaged children who never chose to be part of a mountain feud. The Walker family suffered differently, but suffered nonetheless. Martha Walker visited the Kentucky State Penitentiary every week for 23 years, driving 4 hours each way to spend 30 minutes with her husband through glass, talking about nothing important because everything important had already been destroyed. She developed dementia in 1994, started forgetting who Sam was, where she was, why she was visiting a prison. By 1995, she didn't recognize him at all, would ask the nurses when her husband was coming home, was confused when they told her he was in prison. She died in October 1995 at a nursing home in Harlan, 73 years old, her mind having mercy enough to erase the worst memories before the end. Sam Walker was allowed to attend her funeral in shackles, 3 guards surrounding him, while he stood at her grave. His sons denied even that courtesy. It was the first time he'd been outside prison walls in 23 years. The first time he'd seen the mountains in daylight. The first time he'd felt Kentucky air without bars between him and the sky. He stood at Martha's grave for 17 minutes, said nothing audible, then returned to prison where he would spend the next 16 years before his own death. Marcus Walker struggled most in prison, his PTSD from Vietnam, combining with guilt from the murders into a psychological storm that medication couldn't calm. He spent years in solitary confinement due to violent outbursts, years in psychiatric treatment that helped marginally. He outlived his father, died in Kentucky State Penitentiary in 2014 at 74, having spent 42 years behind bars, more than half his life. Daniel Walker adapted better, used his intelligence to work in the prison library, to help other inmates with legal research, to create something useful from the wreckage of his life. He's still alive as of 2024, 79 years old, serving year 51 of his sentence. Jacob Walker, the youngest, had the possibility of parole after 40 years, but it was denied twice, in 2013 and 2018. He remains imprisoned at age 75, hoping for a third parole hearing that will probably never come, or will come too late to matter. The Walker family name, once respected in Harlan County for 4 generations of hard work and survival, became synonymous with the massacre, became a cautionary tale, became something their descendants tried to escape through distance and name changes. 52 years have passed since that November in 1972, when 10 men died over 40 acres of land, and a poker game played before most of them were born. The Kentucky Moonshine Massacre, as it came to be known, was eventually eclipsed by other violence, other tragedies, the endless American parade of blood that makes yesterday's horror today's footnote. But in Harlan County, among people who remember or whose parents remember, the story persists, told in different ways depending on who's telling it. Some call it justice, mountain law applied when regular law failed. Some call it murder, plain and simple. 10 executions that can't be justified by any historical grievance. Most understand it's both, uncomfortably, irreducibly both. The 40 acres that started it all, the limestone spring property, that Elijah Walker lost and Sam Walker killed to reclaim had a strange legal journey after the massacre. The Brennan family sold it quickly, wanting nothing to do with land that had cost them everything. The development company that bought it sat on the property for 12 years, unable to find buyers willing to purchase ground where so much blood had been shed. In 1985, Sam Walker's court-appointed attorney filed a civil suit on behalf of the Walker estate, arguing that the original 1923 poker game had been fraudulent and the land should be returned to the Walker family. The case dragged through courts for 6 years. In 1991, a judge ruled that yes, the poker game had been rigged, yes, the land transfer had been fraudulent, yes, the Walker family had legitimate claim. The property was awarded to the Walker estate posthumously, a legal victory that came 18 years too late, when Sam Walker was 69 years old and serving year 19 of his sentence, when his sons were middle-aged prisoners with no prospects of freedom, when the people who'd died over the land were still dead, and the people who'd killed for it were still paying. The Walkers never used the land. Martha had died by then, Sam and his sons were in prison for life, and no one else in the family wanted anything to do with property that represented such complete destruction. The estate sold it in 2001 for $87,000 to a commercial development company. Today, that 40 acres holds a Walmart, a strip mall, and a parking lot that serves 3,000 cars a day. The limestone spring still flows, but underground now, piped beneath concrete and asphalt. Its water treated and used for irrigation. Its historical significance erased by progress and the desperate need to forget. Shoppers park their cars over ground where Sam Walker's grandfather once had a moonshine still, where 4 generations of Walkers believed their legacy lived, where 10 people died to determine ownership of something that's now worth less than the blood it cost. Captain James Morrison, the Kentucky State Police investigator who arrested the Walkers, retired in 1997 after 33 years of service. In a 2019 podcast interview about the case recorded when he was 81 years old, and looking back over a career that had seen hundreds of crimes, he spoke about the massacre with a mixture of understanding and condemnation. Technically, the Walkers were mass murderers. Legally, there's no question. They planned and executed 10 killings over 4 days with premeditation and calculation. But morally, it's murkier than I'd like it to be. They were right about the land being stolen. The courts eventually agreed with that. They were right that the justice system had no mechanism to address generational theft, that there was no legal remedy for what had been done to their family. But being right about the theft doesn't justify the killing. It can't. And that contradiction is something I've had to live with every day since November 16, 1972, because I arrested 4 men who were both murderers and victims. Both criminals and people failed by every system that should have protected them. How do you reconcile that? The answer, uncomfortable and unsatisfying, is that you don't. The story became legend in Appalachia, told in different versions depending on who's telling it and what lesson they want to draw. For some, it's a cautionary tale about the dangers of holding grudges, about letting the past poison the present, about how revenge destroys everyone it touches. For others, it's a story about what happens when legitimate grievances have no legal recourse, when the system fails so completely that violence seems like the only option, when desperation and pride combine into something deadly. The truth, as always, is that it's both stories simultaneously, both cautionary tales at once. The Walker Massacre doesn't have heroes. It has Sam Walker, a father who valued his family's legacy more than 10 human lives, who killed methodically to defend a principle that died with him in prison. It has Thomas Brennan and his sons, men who profited from a rigged poker game their father played, who paid with their lives for a crime they didn't commit but benefited from. It has Marcus, Daniel, and Jacob Walker, sons who loved their father enough to become killers, who spent their lives in prison protecting a legacy that turned to ash. It has a system that failed at every level, an economy that abandoned rural America, a legal framework that couldn't address historical theft, courts that took 68 years to acknowledge fraud, but couldn't resurrect the dead. Were the Walkers murderers? Yes. They eliminated 10 people with premeditation and planning, some while they slept, without trial, without mercy, without consideration for the families they destroyed. Were they also desperate men, driven to extremes by circumstances the law couldn't fix? Also, yes. The uncomfortable truth is both things can be true simultaneously. And that's the most disturbing aspect of this story, because it forces us to ask questions we'd rather avoid. What would we do if someone stole not just our property, but our family's identity, our legacy, our place in the world? How far would we go to protect what defines us when the system offers no protection? Does justice exist when the courts are too slow, too distant, too disconnected from mountain codes that governed these hills for centuries before judges and constitutions? Is there a line between righteous anger and unforgivable violence, or does that line disappear entirely when you're pushed far enough? The Walkers crossed a boundary no human being should cross, but that boundary existed in a world where a rigged poker game had legal standing for 50 years, where generational theft had no remedy, where the only currency that mattered was land and water, and the reputation built on both. There's no easy answer, no clear moral, no satisfying conclusion where good triumphs and evil is punished. Just a simple and terrible truth that violence breeds more violence, that broken systems create desperate people, and that sometimes the line between justice and vengeance becomes so thin it disappears entirely, leaving only bodies and questions and families destroyed on both sides. The Walker property, where Sam and Martha raised their 3 sons, where the family planned 10 murders around a kitchen table, was sold for back taxes in 2003. Today it's owned by a family from Ohio who know nothing of its history, who've renovated the house and painted over the past. Their children play in the yard where the Walker boys learned to shoot, where Sam taught his sons that honor mattered more than law, where a father's pride became his son's prison sentence. The Brennan property, or what was left after the fire, was bulldozed in 1975. The land sat empty for decades, locals avoiding it, believing it cursed or haunted or simply too sad to build on. In 2008, a church was built there, a small Baptist congregation of 40 members who wanted to reclaim the ground, to transform the site of violence into a place of peace. The pastor who knew the history said during the dedication ceremony, "This land has seen enough death. It's time for resurrection." Whether that's possible, whether any amount of prayer can cleanse ground that soaked up so much blood, remains an open question. On cold November nights in Harlan County, when temperatures drop to the 30s and fog rolls through the hollows, old-timers still talk about the massacre. They point out where Patrick Brennan died, where the still exploded, where the final confrontation happened. They debate who was right, who was wrong, whether Sam Walker was a monster or a man pushed too far. The younger generation mostly doesn't care, has moved on to new problems, new violence, the endless cycle of poverty and drugs and desperation that plagues rural America in different forms, but with the same underlying cause. The system still fails people here, still offers no easy answers, still creates situations where violence seems like the only option. The names change, the circumstances evolve, but the fundamental question remains: what are we willing to become to protect what we love? What line won't we cross, and what happens when we do? If this story made you think about justice, legacy, and the price we pay when systems fail and old codes collide with modern law, leave your like and share this video. Subscribe to this channel for more true stories that challenge what we think we know about right and wrong, about honor and violence, about how ordinary people become capable of extraordinary darkness when pushed to the edge. Comment below, where do you draw the line between protecting what's yours and losing your humanity in the process? What would you have done in Sam Walker's position, knowing the courts would eventually prove you right, but 50 years too late? Because these stories aren't just history. They're happening right now somewhere, with different people facing the same impossible choices in forgotten corners, where the system has failed and desperation takes hold. The names change, the circumstances evolve, but the fundamental question remains: what are we willing to become to protect what we love? Until next time, remember, the monsters we fear aren't always born that way. Sometimes they're made one stolen acre, one broken code, one desperate decision at a time. And the line between justice and vengeance is drawn not in law books, but in the human heart, where it's always been thinnest, always been easiest to cross, always been hardest to find our way back from. The limestone water still flows beneath that Walmart parking lot, filtered through ancient stone, pure and cold, and completely indifferent to the human drama played out over its ownership. 10 men died to control it. 20 families were destroyed because of it. And in the end, it belongs to no one and everyone, just water flowing underground, waiting to be forgotten like everything else.